Good morning, everyone, and welcome. My name is Tina Goldstein, and I'm the co-director of the STAR Center here at the University of Pittsburgh Medical Center. Together with the director, Dr. David Brent, the program manager, Kim Poling, and the entire STAR team, I am so pleased to welcome you all to our annual conference for the Services for Teens at Risk Center. Our program this year is entitled Promoting Safe and Supportive Environments for All Youth. As we're all so well aware, we're currently facing a crisis of youth mental health in our country. Our collaborative efforts to enhance knowledge, services, and safety for youth at risk for suicide have never been more critical. We're so fortunate to have such an expert lineup today of individuals who will share the most up-to-date research and clinical practice guidelines with suicidal youth. It's my sincere hope that we will all take away meaningful information from our time together today that we can put to use in our important day-to-day work. I and the entire STAR team are incredibly grateful to each and every one of you for sharing your time with us today and for all you do to support young people and their families day in and day out. It's only together that we can move the needle on youth suicide. With that, I'm really honored to introduce to you our first keynote speaker, Dr. ShellyCraig. Dr. Craig is Professor of Social Work at the University of Toronto and the Canada Research Chair in Sexual and Gender Minority Youth. Her program of research focuses on developing affirmative programs and clinical interventions to cultivate the resilience of sexual and gender minority youth. Her work is based on over 25 years of community and clinical practice. She is the developer and tested the first evidence-informed interventions for sexual and gender minority youth mental health, which have now been translated into multiple languages and implemented across the world. She's published over 130 papers on her important work, has led over 35 research studies, and serves on multiple boards of directors that serve marginalized communities. Today, her presentation is entitled Preventing Suicidality in Sexual and Gender Diverse Youth, the Role of Hope, Social Media, and Affirmative Programs. We're so pleased to have you with us today, Dr. Craig. We invite the audience to please put any comments or questions that you have in the chat throughout Dr. Craig's talk. And at the end of her talk, she'll respond to questions. Thank you so much, Dr. Craig.
Thank you so much, Tina. And thank you so much to the entire STAR team, David, Kim, Tina, Jamie, Doreen, all of the folks doing all of the work. And particular thanks to all of you for the work that you're doing. I know you probably had to take time away to attend even this important conference, and the work that you're doing on the ground in schools, in community is what's really making the difference. So really the gratitude that I have is particularly to you all for the work that you are already doing. And as Tina said, I'm going to kind of hop into a conversation and some work that I've been doing and some other great, amazing scholars have actually been doing as well to talk specifically about this population that has been the population I've been grateful to work with for many, many years. So I'm delighted to be here and happy to take any questions sort of probably at the end or throughout. So let me go ahead and start by sharing my screen, which feels like a good place to start in this Zoom world that we live in now. Although I'd much rather be there because you have such an amazing, I'm happy to be in Toronto, but you have such an amazing sort of restaurant and art scene there. Anyway, so welcome, welcome. So as Tina said, today I'm going to talk about essentially suicide prevention with sexual and gender diverse youth. I'm going to talk through some of the key constructs that we find to be helpful. But of course, first we have to talk through, before we can talk about resilience and before we can talk about coping and the ways that we on the ground can essentially be able to support these amazing young people, we really have to also kind of get a little bit of a landscape about what the risks are. So again, delighted to be here, and I will see if we can move things forward. Okay. So today I will be reflecting on, both a lot of the clinical work that myself and many of my colleagues have been involved in. And so hopefully in some ways this resonates with you, as well as a lot of the research work. The primary research approach that we tend to take is, I take a community-based research approach, very much looking specifically at almost like practice-based research in many ways as well. So how do we sort of integrate what we know and very solid science along with some of the sort of clinical expertise and wisdom that we can understand? Because we can have the best interventions in the world and still have a very difficult time implementing them because of some of the structural factors, because of some of the challenges that young people are having, particularly often in school settings, but as well as in home and community. So specifically, we're going to talk about the little bit of a snapshot of the current state of mental health. There's been some great research that's been done recently with a specific focus on suicidality for sexual and gender diverse youth. I'm going to talk some about the role of social media and information communication technologies in their mental health. And I'm going to also highlight some clinical strategies that may be helpful, that we have found to be helpful in our work, specifically with this population. And I will say the acronym, hopefully there's not too many acronym police out there. There are so many. I'm fortunate to be able to work in a number of different countries and work with a lot of different queer youth populations. And so the terminology is a bit different at times, right? So now in academia, we seem to be talking more about sexual and gender diverse youth as the term. We used to say sexual and gender minority youth a little bit more frequently in academia, LGBTQ plus, a little bit more on the field or on the ground. So I will probably use all of these terms, and I'm specifically referring to, essentially the same groups of population. So I just want to kind of mention that there may be a little bit of inconsistency because depending on the research that's been done and the language that's being used or the region that we're kind of thinking about, it can change. So that's okay. This is very much then the focus. We have to always use the language that the young people are using. And if we're open, we want to learn, but if we're open and we're a bit, we have the ability to, sometimes get it wrong and sometimes be corrected, then that helps facilitate, I think, stronger relationships with young people. There are days in which I learned so much from, I've been doing this for a long time, but I learned so much from the, 14-year-olds or 15-year-olds that I'm so lucky to be able to work with. So just kind of thinking about the outline of what we'll talk about today, there's also sort of like a journey, I think, that we personally go through as clinicians that I've also gone through, and to really think about also there's a parallel process in some ways to talk about strengthening LGBT youth mental health through research and practice. So as I said, I started running LGBT youth groups many years ago, sort of on the ground community-based groups. And that has been the continuation of my work and my commitment to this population. It's basically stayed the same. Since 1998, it has changed countries. I was in Florida for a really long time, and this would be a good place to probably be back in Florida doing this work. I know folks are really struggling with all of those damaging and harmful bills that are happening. But really thinking about increasing sort of our awareness broadly and what that looks like and how that can shift over time. We want to understand the experiences of queer youth. We want to acknowledge the risk. We want to think about kind of helping them find their voice in community as much as possible. And in many cases for us, either as members of the community or for folks who might be allies, really thinking about how do we also get the support that we need to be able to do the work on the ground, again, in the schools, in many cases, in the organizations that we are working in, because it is exhausting. I get that. And then thinking about how we can help either young person individually, thinking about sort of systems transform, how do we help ourselves transform through action. I will certainly say that my work within this has been very challenging, I think, in thinking about my working with queer youth, because often we see how much these young people are struggling, and it has in fact in many ways been transformative for me. And so I think that there is the opportunity for those of us that are involved in, clinical and research and practice work to be able to also take on personal journeys in the ways that we are also supporting our young people to do so. So I know we have folks who have a lot of knowledge and a lot of information. So I do have just a tiny bit of background just to kind of set the stage around just sexual orientation and gender identity awareness. So just to sort of think developmentally about kind of what that looks like. So if you probably have a sense of this, and that's okay. But I'll just go over it anyway, so we're all sort of on the same page. So when we think about sexual orientation, this is really thinking about sexual and or emotional. We'll talk about some of the different sort of terms and identities that are emerging, attraction to another person, and the behavior and or social affiliation that may result from this attraction, right? So this is both some of the more historically, some of the identities that we often hear about historically, lesbian, gay, bisexual in many ways, and then we're seeing many more fluid identities now around sexual orientation, pansexual, again, a significant increase in folks who are identifying as bisexual. So folks who are feeling, young people now are feeling like they have perhaps additional options. So, which I think is great. So, and we don't have to perfectly understand it if it isn't our experience, but we just have to join with them to be able to learn what that means. And typically sexual orientation includes sexual attraction, sexual behavior, sexual identity, and those in fact can all be different. So it's not always the same. So those are the three components we think about. It tends to play a bit more of an important role in early adolescence. Usually average ages, this has dropped over time. There's a really good study that was done, a cohort study that was done by Alan Meyer recently, and he looked at specific cohorts. And we are seeing from the ages of usually 12 to 16, we are starting to see the awareness, at least the awareness of a sexually diverse identity, so maybe LGBT identity, or a non-heterosexual identity. Typically, young people feel different, maybe around age 6, age 7. Those of you that are also in the queer community, that probably resonates for you. But we're not necessarily sure what that is. There is more language for it now. But that's something to kind of, take into consideration developmentally. And then the disclosure, both awareness to self and then the disclosure of that identity, those ages are also becoming a little younger. Again, 12 to 18 when folks are telling, usually about like 15, 16. But we do want to, think about whether or not we definitely want to identify coming out as potentially a developmental stage for a queer young person, and it may not make sense for everyone. And there is the possibility that they could be more at a sort of physical and emotional risk when they are out. So there's a couple of things that we'll just want to think about when we're working closely with folks. We just want to make sure that we support them in their goals around disclosure, and that we're also helping them assess any sort of potential risks. And increasingly, a lot of adolescents prefer not to adopt any sort of labels to define their sexuality, but they do still engage in behavior or may have attractions to same gender folks, for example, or identify with a range of sexual diverse communities. So this is normal. This is dynamic. The movement in and out is very stressful, often for parents and caregivers. But this is actually a normative part of, I think, the identity seeking that we're seeing across adolescent development. So we just sort of want to reinforce that this is normal. This is not, anything that is particularly stressful. Well, it can be stressful, but it's, it isn't something that is in any way abnormal. And so, when we think about gender, the gender spectrum, so this is just gender identity is just an individual's internal sense of being male, female, maybe non-binary, gender diverse, or potentially something else. Since gender identity is internal, one's gender identity is not necessarily visible to others. Sometimes folks will dress in the gender that they feel more comfortable, but typically that isn't something we would necessarily always know. So gender expression. So again, thinking about the time periods for awareness, the awareness of gender and becomes is something that emerges much earlier than around sexual orientation. So gender expression, just a couple of terms just to get you familiar, is really how a person represents or expresses one's gender identity to others, often through behavior, clothing, hairstyles, voice, or body characteristics. So I'm a cisgender woman, which means I identify with the biological sex that I was born as, which is female identified, and this is sort of the way that I present, and this is the way that I feel most comfortable. This is not certainly true of many folks. Transgender is kind of an umbrella term that we use that refers to people whose gender identity does not correspond with their assigned sex at birth. So they were given sort of, we do assign sex at birth. That's something that happens, and sometimes that is just incongruent. And then cisgender is essentially somebody who isn't. So certainly like me, someone who isn't transgender. The internal sense of gender identity really emerges in early childhood. Usually around 2, children become conscious of the physical differences between boys and girls and thinking more about the the binary system. Prior to 3, usually most children are easily able to self-identify as a boy, girl, or something else. And by 4, most children have a stable sense of their gender identity. So, often it's quite persistent and consistent when we think about gender identity. However, it is also quite normal for trans and gender diverse young people to identify for the first time during early or late adolescence. And for some folks who have had particularly maybe traumatic early life experiences, sometimes that doesn't happen until midlife or later, when they feel like they have achieved a certain amount of safety where they can actually reveal their true selves. But so that's just tends to be the pattern, not always the pattern, as always. Folks are probably familiar with this. This is the one that we like the most and we use. So just to kind of describe, we use this with middle school kids. We use it, depends on the school sometimes, but we use this to kind of describe sometimes even in trainings to really describe the differences between gender identity, gender expression, our sex assigned at birth, and then who we're physically and emotionally attracted to. So a little bit more about our attractions and sexual orientation. So there's a number of these types of, visuals and graphics that are out there that may be helpful for you when you're working maybe with caregivers or with young people themselves to help them kind of pull it apart and help them understand it a little bit more. Also, the unicorn, I think, is very cute. So let's talk about experiences. And so when we talk about experiences, we just want to get a little bit of a broad understanding of LGBT youth. So about a quarter of millennials, so these are folks who identify now around 18 to 34, identify in some way as LGBT. So that's increasing over time. And that is, I think, because it has become, in some places, again, a lot of caveats here, it has become perhaps a little bit safer to come out or identify as LGBT in some ways, right? Or there are more people who are LGBT within their social circle, so they feel like they can, come out. And an increase, this is a significant increase over what we used to see, which is about 2 or 3%, about 12% identify in some way as gender diverse. In a lot of the research that we've done, which I'll talk about a little bit, we definitely see more risks than non-LGBT youth across 9 key areas. And these are persistent: schools, families, behavioral health, for example. And yet, because the broad approach that we tend to use when we think about our work with LGBT youth is really trying to understand their mental health and trying to understand, what are some of the barriers to mental health care and how can we facilitate those, whether it is in schools, whether it's in community, again, healthcare settings, whatever that looks like. And so we have found in a lot of the research that we have done that LGBT youth may not always seek out professional counseling. Often those are when they're least likely to do this, essentially, due to a lack of affirming services or perhaps providers who aren't competent. I know we're all doing our best in our various different educational settings to try to promote competence within the delivery of services and affirming services to LGBT youth. But ultimately, in some ways, I think the youth are the judge of that, and they have to feel comfortable and safe and that their problems are being improved upon. So, and then but what's interesting is there is an interest in mental health counseling. So in particular, there was a study that was done in 2021. So about half of all LGBT youth reported that they wanted counseling, but they were unable to receive it. So that sort of identifies, I think, a big gap. And again, school-based therapists and counselors are really helpful, I think, in this regard, but sometimes it isn't even enough. It's hard to get to everything that's happening. I certainly know that that's true. And then we do, and I'm going to talk a tiny bit more about this, but LGBT youth are particularly vulnerable with COVID-19. This is really kind of exacerbated. I think this is true for a lot of the youth and probably adults, also maybe some of us. During COVID-19, it really exacerbated some of our risks, but we are seeing increasingly mental health challenges. Some, they had some quarantining with unsupportive family members. They did lose in some ways some of their identity affirming supports. We did a study, it was up here specifically in Canada, was closed down for longer in most places than it was in the US. But we also found that there's a bit of a mixed response to COVID. So at first, during the first, remember we used to talk about waves, the first like 2 or 3 waves, a lot of the young people that we have been working with over time in our randomized control trial up here, for example, they had a mixed response to COVID. So at first, they liked not going to school because school is a place where they were, even in Canada, a lot. They were getting a lot of bullying and they just didn't feel as safe, right? So for some, they preferred to actually be at home because school, they could just avoid the stress of school. After a while, that became something that was a little bit less appealing to them because they also missed their, supportive friends that were helpful, particularly within the context of how long we had virtual school, multiple years up here. And then it was interesting that more than 80%, and this was in another study that was done specifically by Fish, but more than 80% of LGBT youth stated that COVID-19 made their living situation more stressful, and only 1 in 3 found their home to be affirming. So just, again, big sort of context that we can kind of look at. So this is a tough slide to really think about because there have been a lot of amazing folks, you all included, that have been doing a lot of great work to support LGBT youth over the years. So I do believe we are making a difference. And overall, over time, LGBT youth mental health has not really improved significantly over the past decade. Stigma around LGBT identities has in many ways decreased, but LGBT youth, so that's an important piece of the work that we have to do to create more affirming environments and to improve mental health. But it is only one piece of the puzzle. Youth mental health has not improved. And we are seeing across like the multiple countries that I'm working at, pretty consistent high rates of suicidality, which I'll talk about, similar in Canada and the US, which, when I first moved to Canada, I was surprised by that because I thought, oh, it's going to be so much better for queer youth because we have better policies here. And some places, maybe a little bit, but it's interesting that the rates of depression, the rates of mental health have actually either stayed the same or in some cases sort of gotten worse. So we'll talk a little bit more about that, but it is good that the stigma has decreased because I think ultimately that sort of helps. So what is it that we know a little bit? And I will go a little bit more into a deeper dive around the suicidality in particular. But in 2021, a little less than half of LGBT youth seriously considered attempting suicide, and a particularly high rate of trans and non-binary youth. So again, maybe not be surprising to folks, but this is an important piece of, I think, the puzzle in thinking about kind of where we need to address our efforts. And then less than half of the youth with depression or suicidal thoughts have sought professional support. So again, there's a little bit of a gap there. And I think one of the things that we think, it's kind of, I know it's maybe a little bit old school, but one of the things that we think is we're really trying to hustle and we're really trying to work hard to kind of figure out ways to make services as easy to access as possible, to take the services to them. Maybe it's like a field-based kind of case management, if that's something that you can do. Figure out if virtual might be the way to do it. Really trying to not necessarily put the onus on the young person, but how is it that we can bring people in more? How can we bring them into our interventions? How can we bring them into the work? Which is a little bit different than the way that we used to think about it, which is if they really need us, they're going to show up and come to us, right? And so is there a way that we can do that a little bit differently related to both our clinical as well as our research projects, but particularly clinical. And what we know is ages 15 to 24, this is the population and the age in which young people are most likely to experience mental illness and or substance use disorders. So in many ways, mood disorders, we certainly know that mood disorders are the highest, but this is, again, a very important age to target. And then 70% of mental health problems have their onset during childhood or adolescence. So, and then what we see when we put together a couple of different studies is less than 32, so a third to a half of LGBT youth consider their mental health poor or fair, right? And so that is pretty troubling, right? We do believe that young people have the ability to assess their own mental health in many ways, at least around sort of the basics around whether or not their mental health is poor or fair. And if they are identifying that as poor or fair, then that in and of itself, I think, is a little bit of a red flag. It's good that they're able to do that. And how do we help them? So that's, something that I think is important. So there's a big study done by the Trevor Project. And so in the past 2 weeks, which again is a lot of the ways that we think about mental health, about 72% reported symptoms of generalized anxiety disorder. And that, again, high rates, particularly with trans and non-binary youth. And about 62% had symptoms of major depressive disorder in the past 2 weeks, including, again, high rates. So that, again, just a little bit of an understanding of even when we do some of the more clinical measures. And then what are we seeing? And this I think is sort of interesting to think about. This is very new data. So youth death by suicide is, and again, those of you on the ground, this will not be surprising to you probably, but youth death by suicide is on the rise in the US. So, but what's interesting, even with, when we're thinking about some of the stressors of COVID, among adolescents, suicide deaths, according to this recent Van Meter article, are actually decreasing globally, which is, I think, positive, except in 5 OCAD countries, which includes the US, as well as Greece, Mexico, Portugal, and Korea. And so that's really interesting, and something to kind of think about what is maybe specific about our system or the US system. And then the US also has increasing adult suicide death rates between 2000 and 2019, and is the only country with increasing deaths among 5 to 14-year-olds. And we have higher rates of both suicide ideation, which is SI, and suicide attempts since 2007. So that is a very troubling trend. And I think there definitely are some folks who are starting to try to identify exactly why this is happening. But again, we have our LGBT young people that are definitely part of that. So then looking at a study that was looking specifically at, unfortunately, deaths that had been completed, I'll say, by suicide, Ream in 2019 found about 25% of 12 to 14-year-olds who died by suicide were sexual minorities. And the increase among American 11 to 29-year-olds increased particularly after November 9th, 2016, which that is a particularly interesting date for folks who may follow politics. But the primary increase that we're seeing around this is mostly driven by an increase in deaths by suicide by trans youth, as well as youth that might be struggling or questioning. So again, as we think about particular risk factors, those are critical. And then the youngest gender sexual orientation groups at the time of their death were either struggling and questioning and bullied and harassed. We're going to talk about bullying as a risk factor for suicide in LGBT adolescents in a minute. And so again, we see the most commonly used methods, unfortunately, are here. And that's fairly recent data as well that specifically looked at what was used specific to deaths by suicide in the US among sexual minority folks. And then thinking about just a little bit more around some of the data. So it's, so there's significantly, again, so one other piece that's sort of important, and this may or may not be relevant to folks, because I know a lot of folks are also in schools, but I also found it to be interesting that the suicide attempts tend to peak during adolescence, particularly for LGBT folks. They peak specifically during ages 18 and 20. So I think there's a lot of work that can be done in that age group, but also preventative work early on. And those in age 30 to 40, which I think these are just two interesting developmental phases, I will say, to kind of pay attention to when we are thinking about both, screening and intervention. When is it most likely to actually happen? And then there was a study of about 7,000 folks that was completed actually in 2021. And so what we found, compared to cisgender heterosexual youth, trans youth had 5 times the risk of suicidal ideation and about 7.6 the risk of suicide attempt, and particularly high rates with cisgender girls attracted to girls, or folks who are attracted to multiple genders. And so questioning as well was fairly high. So that's kind of interesting. We do see, and I know this is something that folks will be talking about later on, we do see sometimes a little bit of a gender split around suicidal ideation and suicide attempts. But I think it's quite interesting when we think about also the risk that girls have, female identified folks actually have within the context of some of the work that we're doing as well. That isn't always necessarily where we focus our attention. So I think that's something to kind of think about. And then, so what are some of the common suicide risk factors? So common suicide risk factors that apply to all youth also apply to queer youth. And then we can kind of layer on some of the other experiences. So you see to my left, so some of the common suicide risk factors are related to gender, being a racial ethnic minority, living in a rural area, having experienced extreme childhood trauma, having a history of bullying, a psychiatric disorder, having a history of non-fatal self-injurious behavior. So again, sort of, non-suicidal self-injury, cutting, those kind of things. And of course, a history of anxiety and depression. Those we do see as common risk factors essentially across the board. So then some additional risk factors that, well, they both can be cumulative and also integrated, but thinking about the relationship between discrimination and, potentially additional discrimination if you are from population that is experiencing racism in some ways or some sort of cultural-based discrimination. Coming out at an early age, again, we just want to be nuanced about this. We don't want to keep young people in the closet because of our own fear, and coming out at an early age before 16 years old still may generate additional rejections and potentially bullying in some ways. It may be something that create young people then become a little bit more of a target. So again, this is nuanced. I'm not saying we don't want folks to come out if this is something that they really feel like they want to do, but we just want to help them think about, when you do this, how is it that we're going to ensure that you are able to process some of the stressors that you might be experiencing, right? And lack of family acceptance, we know, is a particular risk for LGBT youth suicide. Not feeling accepted where one lives is a particular factor that was part of a recent study that Rhymes did, which I think is really interesting, that directly contributes to suicidality, and then generally unsupportive environments, which can include schools and as well as often homes. Sometimes religious institutions, depending on the study. A lack of social connectedness for LGBT youth, or unsatisfactory or minimal peer support. So these are particularly identity affirming supports if somebody has less than 5 friends, for example. And then we do see there's a couple of studies that look specifically at body image, specifically for folks who identify in some way as female identified, and histories of emotional abuse and sexual abuse are even more. Those are certainly risk factors for all suicidality, but particularly for our populations here. So diving into a couple of these a little bit more. Bullying. So again, I know, a number of folks are working in schools. So in a recent study that was conducted, I think this is the 2023 study, about 25% of all students in this particular study had experienced either traditional or cyberbullying. So this is using the Youth Risk Behavior Survey data specifically. They did find that LGBT students had higher rates of bullying. Okay, not that, unfortunately, is not surprising. And students who experienced both forms of bullying had the highest prevalence of suicide attempts across all sexual orientations. So, however, it wasn't necessarily cumulative. So it wasn't that if you experienced traditional and cyberbullying that your risk was higher. It was just that if you had it wasn't statistically significant, right? So it would definitely was slightly higher, but it wasn't statistically significant, which was a little bit surprising. So what that means is any form of bullying, traditional only, electronic only, or both, was associated with higher risks of suicide attempts when they parsed that out in terms of the analysis. So we can target our efforts, I think, on reducing bullying, but also reducing the impact of bullying on the young people that we're working with. And then when we think about non-suicidal self-injury, it is more prevalent both in frequency and severity among the LGBT community. Interestingly, it's highest among bisexuals, folks who identify as bisexual. And so the severity of the non-suicidal self-injury adds to the risk of suicide in sexual minorities, but it doesn't necessarily amplify that risk. So it impacts, so sexual minority status impacts suicidality through the non-suicidal self-injury. So that creates an increase, which then increases suicidality. But there isn't a direct relationship, which is sort of interesting. So again, it is about how do we help them manage the stressors, the minority stressors that they have as LGBT young people, to be able to then help them to prevent suicide. So a lot of that is based on how do we help them deal with the bullying? How do we help them, cope with non-suicidal, some of the non-suicidal self-injury that they might be involved in. So there's several points of intervention there. And then, so a couple of other things that are kind of emerging as relevant to LGBT youth. So higher rates of sadness and hopelessness, particularly sometimes for racialized populations or racial minority populations. So this idea of less hopelessness, and so, increased hopelessness, less hope, is something that I think is a particular factor for LGBT folks. And so this has now become, which I'll talk about, a focus of a lot of our work, is how do we help LGBT young people increase their hope, because we know that that is a particular risk factor for their own suicidality. And then what we're seeing is, and again, this probably not shocking to folks, but we do see there's an interesting study that was done actually in, I'm not sure if this was Australia, I think so, that students that experience school-based conversion ideology, so conversion therapy, reparative therapy, the idea that being gay in some way is bad and should be changed, like there's something wrong with you, led to problems in school, so reduced concentration, lower grades in attendance, an increase in self-harm, both consideration and actually engaging in it, and higher rates of considering suicide and attempting suicide. So this idea of this conversion ideology, which young people are really exposed to, and when we talk about in a way that maybe for some of us who are in this kind of like bubble where we're doing this mental health work and we're not necessarily as aware of some of the messages the young people that we're working with are getting, it is really interesting that there are still, and we're seeing this now, I think, related to some of the bills that are coming out, but there are a lot of young people who in fact are experiencing some of these conversion therapies that we think are sort of gone by the wayside. These are really re-emerging as areas that particularly parents who are perhaps desperate and angry are trying to get their children to change. And so they're going to, usually non-licensed therapists and those kind of things. But there's a lot of conversion therapy that's happening, particularly around gender identity, but also still around sexual orientation. And so the Myers study that I was talking about before, the cohort study, he looked specifically at 3 different cohorts, and the oldest cohort that he looked at was basically the Stonewall generation. And the Stonewall generation, about 8% of them had experienced some sort of conversion therapy. Then he looked at the equality generation, which is essentially what I would call the millennial generation. So they're the folks who have experienced the sort of Ellen DeGeneres coming out, for example, those kind of things sort of earlier on in their adolescence. And still 6% of that population, this is a randomized study, had actually experienced some sort of conversion therapy. So that was higher actually than we sort of had thought would be the case. And I don't know I think he was maybe even surprised a little bit about that. So a lot of folks are still experiencing some sort of conversion therapy. So it's something to think about. When we think about, okay, I'm going to keep going. When we think about social media and suicide, the data is mixed. right? In some ways. So social media use and youth suicide is pretty, when we think about the relationship, is pretty mixed and nuanced. I already talked a little bit about the cyberbullying piece, but there is a particular link between social, not generally social media necessarily, but social media and suicide, found specifically around social media users who are seeking out self-harm or suicide related content. So that specifically is a relationship between suicidal ideation and attempts and social media use, which I think sort of makes sense. It was just something that we're really only seeing if social media, we're really only seeing in the US, more so again, unfortunately, and if social media use alone were a risk factor for suicide, then we would expect a corresponding increase in suicidal ideation among all youth that use social media a lot, which is basically all youth at this point, right? However, there was only an increase in suicidal ideation in the US and not necessarily in a lot of these other more Western countries. So that's one of the things that I think is sort of interesting. So where is it that US adolescents specifically are going with their social media use, and that is fueling perhaps some of the suicidal ideation. I'll talk a little bit more about the relationship for queer youth in a little bit. And then, so there was a study that was done. This is a machine, basically like a machine learning study, which is very interesting, that was done actually. Specifically, I think up here, but I think included the US and Canada. And so what they found in this very large sample is 50% of all the participants had suicidal thoughts in the past year. So these are LGBT youth. And but it was a bidirectional relationship. If you see the first sort of risk, they sought help at the start of the pandemic for support. And so basically, essentially, if they're experiencing some suicidal thoughts or suicidal ideation, they are seeking help, right? And seeking help can sometimes help them recognize that they are struggling with suicidal ideation. So that's an interesting one. And some of the other pieces that I think were really important are self-rated mental health status, having insulted by the parents or adults, ever hearing that being LGBT is not normal, age, feeling depressed in the past week, lifetime diagnosis of mental illness or depressive disorder, feeling sad in the past week. And the last one, which I thought was sort of interesting, in the top 10 predictors, ever pretended to be straight or cisgender in some way to be accepted, right? So having to act and perform in a way that was not their authentic selves. So one of the, we want to think about what some of the protective factors are. So we have found that policies, particularly policies that are state level anti-bullying laws, have been found to reduce bullying, victimization, depression, and suicidal ideation, with the largest effects for LGBT folks, LGBTQ folks, as well as females. So just having there's a direct relationship between having state level anti-bullying laws, which I know a lot of states are, it's the total opposite of what they're dealing with now, but and thinking about a specific reduction in suicidal ideation and as well as planning. So then a couple of additional that I think that may be specific to folks, thinking about suicide risk for trans folks. So there's a study that talked about folks 13 to 24 that lived in the US. And this is just about having incongruent documentation. So like a passport, a driver's license, for example, an ID, had actually higher rates of attempting suicide, so greater odds of attempting suicide in the past year than folks who wanted to, folks who wanted to update one's documents but were not able to because of maybe legal policies or someone wasn't able to help them, had greater odds of attempting suicide, as well as being able to update one's documents but not having done so. So having some, but not all, gender concordant identification documents is associated with reduced suicidal ideation. So this study was really interesting, and this is something that we're really including now in a lot of our intervention work, is really thinking about something as doesn't seem basic, right? But something as sort of tangible as, okay, let's assess what their documents are, and let's assess whether or not we can actually help them make changes to their documents, because we know that this actually reduces suicide risk. So that's a particularly interesting sort of tangible piece that I think can be built into like a case plan or built into some of the work that we do. Another protective factor is, for, again, similar approach in terms of the analysis compared to folks who want a gender affirming hormone therapy. So talk a little bit more about that later if we need to. And those who wanted it but didn't receive it, for those who were able to access and use gender affirming hormone therapy, there are lower rates of recent depression. And for those who are over 18, lower rates of serious suicidal ideation, and under 18, lower odds of past year suicide attempts. And what we do know is for the young people who are able to get gender affirming hormone therapy, of course, it makes sense, they tend to be more likely to have parents who are supportive. And then the other piece that's really helpful is thinking about optimism. So the idea of a belief in a better future, the opposite of hopelessness, has been found to reduce suicidal ideation. So thinking about particularly trans and gender non-binary folks, which is TGNB, really thinking about optimism, and optimism directly reduce suicidal ideation, and also indirectly by helping them feel more accepting of their bodies, which then also impacts suicidality. So how do we help with the young people that we're working with that are trans and non-binary? Either make some modifications, if this makes sense, or help them be more accepting of their bodies, even in the state that, whatever state they're currently in, to try to help them reduce the suicidality. So it's almost like a manifestation of gender dysphoria. So then a couple of things that I think are important that we found from a little bit of practice literature is there, again, we've talked about LGBT youth not necessarily seeking support and care, even when they see that there's a little bit of that they might be struggling a bit with suicidal ideation in some ways. But what they found too is that there should be more of a focus. So you all are doing this. You all are really like paving the way. It's very cutting edge. I think everything that's happening at STAR is really thinking about the promotion of clinician competence in both addressing LGBT issues and suicidality, and being able to bring those up and talk about them, and the intersection of those two, right? So some of the young people in this study talked about, well, this provider was good with suicide, but they weren't really comfortable with like LGBT identities, right? And so that was something that they really talked about as being, those are both really, really difficult to talk about. And they found like it was really positive when providers acknowledged and validated that the suicidal thoughts were happening and took time to explore what was behind them. And they found it to be negative, which of course everybody here would know, but when the suicidal thoughts were perhaps overly normalized, or saying, oh, well, you're trans, so this is something that happens a lot, right? Or trivialized in some way. So that I think was really interesting in terms of thinking about this recent study that was done by Lang. So I'm going to keep moving. Very quickly go over one of our studies that was done it ended just before the pandemic. So I just want to take that into consideration. We did a big study called Project Query. You see all the states and provinces that were part of it. And so our average age of participants, we had about 7,000 participants, average about 50% were under 18, which is a fairly large amount. Then you see the types of communities that folks are actually living in. So it's a wide range. Wide range of sexual orientations and gender identities in many ways. So you see, we had to categorize them into umbrellas. We had about 80 sexual orientations. We really thought we were being comprehensive, and still. And then we had quite a few gender identities. So we did put them in umbrellas. So a pan umbrella would be like a pansexual, pan-romantic umbrella, for example. But you see a lot of the more fluid identities that are being embraced in many ways by our participants. So that's important to think about when we're doing data collection, both clinically on forms, as well as thinking about as well as research. And then the threats that we found that are critical and issues to their well-being and mental health were these minority stressors, interpersonal and environmental and microaggressions, the internalization of that, so the self-stigma, and then of course ACEs, which folks are familiar with. And when we think about minority stress, we think about often Myers model, and we think about this broad context that these young people are living in. So we will just call it a homophobic and transphobic context, having a sexual and or gender minority identity. And we did find with our Affirm clinical trial that recently wrapped up that about 60% of the participants identified as both a sexual minority and a gender minority. We understand that those experiences can be quite separate, and we have to figure out how to provide services in a way that integrates both of those and validates both of those in many ways. So they have these identities, then they have these experiences, the bullying, if you will, the microaggressions that are identity-based stigmas and discriminations that they go through. And then that is why we see negative mental and behavioral health outcomes. It's not because of their identities, it is because in many ways of the ways that they have been treated, and then the ways that they're internalizing a lot of that to think about themselves as less than. As part of this study, we looked specifically at the daily stressors of LGBT youth, and we just found that they were super stressed. And so we found this to be, we were only looking at LGBT youth in this study, so we didn't have a comparison group. But in terms of they were very or fairly likely to experience on a daily basis, they felt stressed, they felt like they were unable to control their life, they felt like they couldn't cope with things that were happening, they felt angered quite easily. And so that's, I think, already just something to take into consideration when we're working with LGBT youth and thinking about the suicidality. Stress is obviously a driver in many ways. So how do we help them think about and reduce their stress? Some of the interpersonal risk factors that they talked about, and I'll talk about this a little bit more, issues of restrooms, high rates of internalized, so thinking negatively about myself as an LGBT person in some way, hearing those messages that are negative and making them mine can really impact our both attempts and ideation, of course. And then thinking about our adverse childhood experiences. So we know that there's a significant, relationship between ACEs and suicidality. Lots of great work has been done around that. We do find that to be true for queer youth as well. Folks understand, I think, what ACEs are, so I'll keep going. What we found in this particular study is that LGBT youth had high rates of trauma. This is something that I have published on, and 4+ ACEs are associated with poor health and mental health. And this is a community-based sample from all the states and all the provinces that I was talking about, but the average was about 3 ACEs just for community-based sample. This, again, not folks who were in any way in care. So that's, I think, a little troubling. And so what we found, particular high rates of emotional neglect, emotional abuse. So these are some things that we're trying to target in some of our interventions, or living in a household with significant mental illness or substance abuse. So having to manage that as well as manage your own mental health struggles is particularly challenging. And then we just see the rates of the general population versus our LGBT population. And you just see there that emotional abuse, physical abuse are significantly higher. So again, we're thinking about those ACEs could relate to the young person's LGBT identity, could relate to poor parenting, right? Could be integrated. It's very difficult to pull that apart, and we almost don't need to. We just have to really think about the fact that these young people that we're working with are probably struggling with some ACEs. We know that disparities are not caused by LGBT identities, but rather thinking about the discrimination. So then what we found in this study is the significant impacts. 80% of the youth in our study reported moderate depression. The significant drivers of that were ACEs, transphobia, internalized transphobia, microaggressions. And then when we think about the suicidality, a couple of the things that I think are interesting, we found differences between attempts, which were specifically interpersonal microaggressions. And then in thinking about the suicidal ideation, We did find that school belonging in particular was something that was related to the last 6 months suicidal ideation, which was really interesting, specifically the emotional neglect by the family and the internalized self-stigma. So those are two different. So sometimes we might want to think about attempts and ideation a little bit of a different way when we think about the pathways to care. And then each episode of LGBT harassment and victimization in a Trevor Project study that was done increases the likelihood of self-harming behavior by about 250%. So thinking about how do we help decrease, again, this ties back to that bullying that I was talking about, how do we decrease that? Folks are probably very familiar with this construct. This is something that we've used in a recent study that we 3 years ago maybe published. And so we talk about the interpersonal theory of suicide. So we really think about that specific to the queer youth, and the interpersonal theory of suicide, again, with this group, folks probably know, but tends to integrate 3 different approaches. So particularly what we often focus on is this idea of perceived burdensomeness and thwarted sense of belonging. So we find that our LGBT young people often take on feeling like they are so different and they are a burden to their families because they're different, they're causing stress, right, to their communities. And that then increases the desire for suicidality, as well as the thwarted sense of belonging. So feeling like they don't fit in because of those identities, which is why the focus on school belonging was really interesting in the study that we did. And so we do see that rejection and victimization by families can lead to a sense that youth are not needed or wanted, and that they would be better off if they were not there. And so that is kind of the way that we think about interpersonal theory of suicide. And so we do focus on trying to figure out how do we reduce them feeling like they are a burden to others, right? It's really not about them. It is about, in many ways, their parents, and their parents' lack of acceptance doesn't mean that they have to feel like they're a burden. And how do we create as many opportunities as possible for them to belong? The only other one I wanted to hit on really quickly is there's been a little bit of work that's been done with the IMV model. And so that specifically emphasizes feelings of, and these are talking about the relationship of these 2 feelings to suicidality, which they found to be high. Emphasizes feelings of defeat in which LGBT youth may experience from trying and failing to change their sexual orientation or gender, and entrapment, and they feel like things will never get better. So again, this ties to this construct of hope that we are trying to always increase within the context of our work with LGBT young people. How do we help them think about and plan for and work towards a better future where they can be their authentic selves? So just thinking about what can help, and I sort of talked about this. How do we help them feel supported by their peers? How do we help them feel supported by their parents and caregivers, if that's something that's helpful? And if their parents and caregivers do not have the capacity to do that, how do we help figure other people out who could be who could kind of stand in and do that? Is there a grandparent? Is there an aunt? Is there a cousin? Is there somebody else that can be helpful? And then thinking about how do we increase this sense of belonging? Thinking about also trying to help them increase their optimism, which I talked about, trying to help them increase their self-acceptance. Again, recognizing that these negative messages that they're constantly getting bombarded with, those are not their messages. Those are other people's messages, maybe politicians' messages that are trying to further their political careers with these bills that we're seeing in a number of states, including Florida. How do we increase hope, right? How do we help them think about the future in a way that can be definitely related to reduced suicidality? Very quickly, I'm recognizing the opportunity for time, so I'm just going to do a couple of quick discussions of social media, and then I'll hop into a couple recommendations. So what we found in our research is that social media has both positive, I told you it was mixed before, positive and negative impacts on mental health and well-being. What we do see over time is that young people are significantly involved. It used to be that we were just consumers of media, right? We just sit in front of the TV. That would be something that we would sort of, just do. We would just consume. We didn't have any choice. Now there's a lot more options, which is really interesting. And young people are significantly involved as producers and creating media. in ways that can resonate more with themselves and help them kind of re-author some of the narratives. And so that's really helpful. We found that to be interesting. We do find that not we know still, and we think that this is related to the, ongoing issues with mental health that young people are experiencing. Not all LGBT young people live within affirming homes and community environments, so being online can be safer for them. And online spaces do not create, but they reflect the structural discrimination in our worlds. So that's, I think, something to kind of think about. There is a lot of online negativity that young people might experience and be able to manage, but they feel like still, we found in a big study that we did in every single community, even in urban areas, even in Toronto, I was surprised by this, that being online was still significantly safer for LGBT young people than being offline, because they felt like they had some control. Being in school, sometimes they don't feel like they have control. Being at home, they don't feel like they can kind of manage. They can manage their online use, and there's a certain amount of self-efficacy there. So, and seeking out supportive content and friends, we sort of understand that as an act of resilience, even if that isn't something that they can potentially find offline, which I know that language in and of itself probably dates me. So I talked a little bit about this, that there are risks and benefits around connection and ongoing discrimination. We have found that, online support in some of the work that we've done, the language that young people are using specifically around the language that their online communities are home to them, belonging. So remember, the interpersonal theory of suicide talks about the role of belonging. Maybe this is a place that they can find it, is online. It's really like saving grace, family, kept me alive. It's so interesting. And there are these different mentoring networks that we're learning about in which LGBT youth who are kind of moving through, I have a visual of it, that are essentially moving through and supporting one another and almost moving into kind of a mentoring role for people that they haven't met in person, but might have similar identities and kind of helping them cope with the stressors that they're experiencing. It's very nuanced and it's very sophisticated what is happening, I think, online. And some quotes here from some folks that they talk about, particularly this trans woman who talked about social media giving me hope. Again, hope is a really important construct. We want that to be part of our clinical and school-based interventions. And we also want to recognize that we don't want to discourage young people from finding it wherever they can. This is the piece that we were talking about. I don't have time to really get into it, but thinking about the cultivating of digital resilience, or how young people are using their online access and their online, often social media, to work through a whole lot of different, almost like developmental tasks in some ways, I will say, and processes in which it helps them become essentially more resilient. So they're doing better in terms of like the resilience scores and what that means, learning how to regulate and moving to sort of advocating and leading and mentoring other folks who are sort of online. So these online worlds, almost like the manifestations of resilience that we're seeing through their online interactions, is again really interesting. We want it to be everywhere. We want it to be offline, but we are also recognizing that it is important that it's happening wherever it's happening. It's important that it's happening. I talked, I think, a little bit about COVID-19. Just briefly talk about some of one of the other things that we've been testing and trying to identify is whether or not online interventions are helpful for LGBT youth. So we've adapted during during COVID, again, still sometimes that, we have our Affirm intervention, which is Affirm's CBT intervention. And that is something we kind of did an analysis layering on the COVID stressors, minority stressors, and what Affirm was able to bring throughout COVID. And we do find, it's not for everyone, but we do find online access and online interventions are something that LGBT young people are really responding to in many ways, or if there can be a little bit of a hybrid. So online, not online, maybe with a little bit of a, definitely with a live component and online facilitation where they're able to meet with other folks as well. And then they could potentially also take that offline to have a few groups offline. We're finding a hybrid or an online only to be a very effective approach. A couple more things. So just thinking about affirmative, what does it mean to be affirmative? Sort of talked about that, I think, already, as we want to be as supportive as we can, while recognizing that we want to celebrate, not just validate, but we want to celebrate all sexual orientations and gender identities. And we recognize the structural stigma that is still happening and is really negatively impacting their mental health and suicidality. We want to be as trauma-informed as possible and recognize that these traumatic events and experiences, whatever they are based on, often related to real or perceived gender identity and sexual orientation, threaten their sense of safety. So we want to think about how do we help them restore their sense of personal safety, even in the work that we're doing with them, and how do we connect them to safe and affirming individuals and communities? How do we mobilize strengths? How do we as the clinicians hold the hope, even if it's really hard to do that sometimes? Maybe they've showed up, right, to you. Maybe they came, maybe they're not talking, but maybe they actually showed up to the session with you, or they came to school in a day when it was difficult because they're often being bullied. There are some things, sometimes it's just showing up. We have to figure out how to hold the hope for them and how to reframe and support, because that in and of itself, I think, is part of a intervention that can help reduce suicide, certainly. And we certainly want to think about how do we create spaces that are as affirming as possible. And so LGBT youth who reported having at least one affirming space had about a third reduced odds of reporting suicide in the past year. So in particular, the affirming online spaces, so reinforcing what I said before, more had that than about half had an affirming home space, which was really important. And then affirming school space, which is really important. And then about a third had an affirming home space. But the strongest association with reduced suicide attempts were actually LGBT affirming schools. So I think that's really important for those of you that are, I know we'll have some great talks about school-based work in a few minutes. We also want to make sure another suicide intervention that is, I think, really interesting and maybe not that difficult to do is using affirming names and pronouns. So just asking specifically if you could use what the name is that the young person wants to be called, and ensuring that the pronouns are consistent with what they want to be called, led to particularly school, home, work, and with friends. Young people who could use their name in all four areas had a significant decrease in suicide. So really starting by asking the pronouns and really thinking about, what name do you want to be called versus whatever name is on the sheet, right? Or thinking about that can also be a really helpful, somewhat simple intervention, I think, it helps them feel seen and validated, right? Like they matter. Again, not assuming what young people are experiencing. Oh, I think I have to wind down. And then I'm not going to talk really about this. We have lots of work that we've done around affirmative CBT that has been helpful in thinking about reducing depression and suicide. So just we want to make sure that we are not challenging or minimizing LGBT identities, thinking of that's about us, it's not about them, viewing it as attention seeking, adolescent rebellion, those kind of things. We want to make sure that we're meeting them where they are, with the understanding, like I said at the beginning, that there will be some ebbs and flows in the way that they understand their experiences and identities, which in fact, if we're honest, is true for all of us in many different situations. Let's not try to make the bar too high for LGBT services. This is what we see in schools a lot. Oh, maybe we need an extra permission slip. Maybe we need, to do this. Maybe we need to make sure that the parents sign on. We shouldn't make, because that then already creates difference. How do we kind of integrate it into the everyday services that are happening within the school setting or the hospital setting in particular? Let's not make it too hard or a little bit extra because we feel nervous. That's not helpful in many ways. And we find certainly when there is always a requirement of parental permission, that young people are not always able to participate in the same way. Again, I talked about this, use affirm named and pronouns, ask gently, but don't be afraid to ask about their identities, ask about their history of suicidality, ask about their self-harm, and be trustworthy, show up and follow through in whatever it is that we are talking about. Really thinking about considering the role of social media. What does that mean? Maybe let's think about it a little bit differently. If it makes sense, let's learn from them. I'm constantly learning from the young people that I work with. I do research in this area and I feel like I really don't know, so I'm learning from them a lot. And really thinking about what maybe there's a role for digital mental health interventions in the work that you're doing. Really trying to make sure that we are always engaging in a strengths-based stance. Really thinking about curiosity, asking questions about their identities, being as curious as possible, having a curious stance, and really thinking about what is it that I can do? Where do I want to be in terms of my own development? Thinking about an inventory, that's something I do pretty frequently. What is it that I need to learn more about? What is the next step that I can take? And then thinking as an organization, is there a place that we can think about where we want to be and what the next step is specifically that we can take? And then just thinking about the fact that LGBT youth and brains that there's a range of identities. Technology can be helpful. They're still struggling significantly with suicidality. In many ways that has potentially increased, as I talked about, but there are some very clear from the research, there are some clear places that we can intervene in thinking about the role of social media and thinking about how do we cultivate optimism, how do we cultivate hope, and then thinking about always thinking about, are there even tangible things like helping LGBT, trans and non-binary clients maybe revise legal documents, that kind of thing. So really doing your best to try to educate yourself. I know I fit a lot in with this. And so I really want to thank everybody. I'm a little bit over, not surprisingly, because I get very excited about this, but a little bit over, but I just want to thank everybody for the amazing work that you all have done. And hopefully this is a little bit helpful, and I'm looking forward to the rest of the presentations that we will have later. So I am going to actually stop sharing because it is time for me to stop talking. So thank you all so much. I really appreciate all the work that you're doing, and I am now silencing myself.
Dr. Craig, thank you so much. That was an incredibly comprehensive talk. You covered so much, and clearly there's so much to say, and your passion is really evident. We're really grateful. We do have plenty of really thought-provoking questions in the chat. And so I welcome individuals to, keep bringing their questions to the chat, and I'll verbalize them for you and then you can respond. So our first question is about gender diverse youth. So in the past, most of people identifying as gender diverse were assigned male at birth. Over the last few years, we've seen that changing to up to 70% of folks who identified as gender diverse were assigned female at birth. We would be interested in your thoughts about potential explanations for this change that we've seen over the last couple of years.
That's very interesting. I'd actually like to ask additional, but ask additional questions about that. I will say two things. I think that historically, there's two things. There's something about, I think, the historical role of gender and gender socialization that I think has kind of paved the way for changes in folks identifying in a range of different ways. There's also been an increase in I think depending on what media, but there's been an increase in the number of trans or gender diverse characters that we are seeing in the media that then are I think young people are able to see, and folks who are not young as well, are able to see themselves reflected and feeling much more comfortable in sharing their identities in some ways. That is not a pattern we're necessarily seeing everywhere, I want to say. It just sort of depends. The other piece that we are seeing quite a bit too is the idea of, and I know we sort of group everybody together, but the non-binary, or what we used to call gender non-conforming experience, we are seeing a significant increase as well in young people who are identifying that way, sometimes more than cisgender. And so that, I will say, we think the media has something to do with it. We think that gender role and gender expectations have something to do with it. We also feel like there's been an increase in the number of, again, you can't tell with all the policies, but in the number of gender affirming sort of clinics and services and interventions that are being offered, even in rural areas. And so that in and of itself has been something that I think has driven folks to be able to feel more comfortable to come out. So that's not, I know that's not a specific answer to the question, but I do feel like that is, I do think it's an interesting trajectory. And I think there's a number of different factors that are related to that. And I also think that's something to increasingly look into. And the other piece of it is it's important. And how does that impact the way that we're doing our work or offering our services? We just want to make sure that our services are specific to the experiences of the young people that are, coming to us, and we're as knowledgeable as possible about what their experiences are. And folks can have the same identities and have totally different experiences, right? And completely different clinical needs as well, right? Just because they share a particular identity, once we learn from them what that means, what their journey was like, then even though on paper they might look the same, in fact, the way that we might work with them might be quite different. So I think it's a great question. I just want to say the other thing that we're sort of trying to figure out is, how do we provide specific services for folks who are non-binary? This is just been such an increase, even in the gender clinics as well, that we're working with. So I think it's really interesting to try to, how do we include them in services? What types of services do they need? Because it is a very different pathway and experience. So that's one thing that sort of clinically, I'm sure you all are probably doing some great work around that. We're trying to understand that as well to figure out how to support.
Thank you so much. Indeed, it does seem like it's evolving right before our eyes in terms of our own knowledge and understanding and youth's own ways of conceptualizing their identities. So I really appreciate your approach to that. Our next question is from Amy, who asks, in working with LGBTQ plus students, I found that some of the online connections, chats, etc., that are supposed to be supportive occasionally become bossy, bullying by doing things like shaming the youth, saying they're not transitioning correctly, listing absolute lists of things they need to be doing to be considered authentic, giving them a label. This type of experience is particularly damaging to the youth because they trust that these are safe spaces. What are your thoughts on this?
This is such a great point. So two things. We find this also sometimes in the groups that we run, right? So you will have, it's almost like a linguistic acculturation in some ways, right? So it is essentially like young people who may have been in LGBT spaces or communities longer that have this language that are basically telling or schooling the other young people who might be newer about how it should be, right? So when it's in a group setting, you can in fact regulate that. You interrupt that and you say that has been very specifically your experience. But when you are in fact telling people that it has to be one way, that is the same as what you're reacting to. Your parents telling you have to, or whoever saying that you have to be this particular gender, right? Why is it that that's something that's really important to you, right? Why is it that so we're pretty assertively interrupting that within the context of our groups. Online, absolutely, it does happen, right? And so what we do find is it's sometimes difficult it's very difficult, I know, for parents to talk about, social media use. In some studies, it's even harder for parents to talk about social media use and the phone use with their kids than it is sex, which is really interesting. They're both hard. And so one of the things I think that we as clinicians, though, can do is we can say, yes, and within the context of these spaces, there's always people who share your identities that do not have your experience that are going to try to, that might try to tell you there's a right way to do it. Everybody's journey is different. So you can do a little bit of work. Sometimes we do a little bit of work around, okay, let's think through how we navigate ourselves online, how we protect ourselves online. And protecting ourselves online sometimes isn't from the people who are, who we would think. They could be people from inside the community that have their own ideas that are actually quite damaging because maybe they're coming from a damaged place. So it's about teaching them to think about kind of responsible not letting it all out necessarily, even if it's an online form. How do they think about protecting themselves? How do they think about what they're really looking for and what they need within the context of their online interaction? So really helping them kind of think this through and map it out and identify if there's something that doesn't feel right to them, they don't have to stay there. They don't have to stay in these communities. Let's help them understand what is affirming to them within the context of these online communities and offline, and then help them figure out how to manage that or regulate that. So we do see kind of like a pathway sometimes where they're in these, and then eventually they move into kind of like a mentoring, or they feel more comfortable kind of interrupting that. So sometimes we'll even do a role play and we'll be like, okay, so this person online has said this thing to you about this is how you have to be trans, right? This is often around gender identity stuff. And we will say, so you know that's not true, right? And what makes sense to you? How do you want to handle this? Is there a way, is there something you might say to them, right? And sometimes they'll like text or email this. Is there something that you might say that might say, you know, this is your opinion, and maybe they'll double down, but in which you can kind of defend yourself and say, this is your opinion, but that is not the experience of everyone, right? So helping them parse that out. So it's not an all or nothing thing. Just because they're in a queer space, they are not going to necessarily feel supported. We know lots of queer spaces are super racist, right? We know that's the case. So we can kind of say, this is terrible. It does not mean somebody that has the same, identity as you is in fact has the same experience as you. So we have to figure out how to help them, manage themselves and manage those relationships as well. I think it's really important. So it's almost like an intervention on managing their own social media use, to be able to use that in a way that is supportive to them.
Thank you. There's a closely related question here about recommendations around an age or ages or developmental maturity level where youth can navigate online support.
Yeah. I mean, I think that's different. It depends sometimes on the young person, right? And how long they've had access to technology, right? But mostly they're always connected. And so I think we tend to think it can't hurt to start to have those conversations younger, right? And helping them figure out, so sometimes in like our groups or our online work, we'll try to gather from young people the places that are particularly supportive, and then they can share those with one another, or we'll share them even as part of a research project, right? So we do find, sometimes, 8 to 10 can sometimes be a way they can at least start to have those conversations and start to think about what feels comfortable for them, and also helping them figure out where are good places to get information and to get support, right? Because it may not be that the sort of like, I'm just going to date myself, chat rooms, it's not 2001 anymore, but like chat rooms or those places where they're going are in fact, or Instagram, for example, are in fact necessarily the best places. Let's help them figure out other places where they can seek and find support as well. But we are starting to have those conversations. And again, it is related to the other comment about helping teach them sort of almost like a digital self-efficacy or like a digital literacy in some ways, and thinking about how they can use it, what helps them feel good when they're using technology, what helps them feel bad, and how they can steer themselves towards, things that are helpful to them versus harmful. So it is something that we do cover often in a lot of our work directly with youth, because it is personal and developmentally, it has to be, I think, as appropriate as possible, but helping them recognize that just because something is, looks like it's LGBT doesn't mean it's going to be positive for them. Helping them, become a little bit more discriminating can be great.
Excellent. Thank you. There's tons of accolades in the chat as well that I hope you'll also take a look at. We have time for one last question, and this is one about school belonging. So we have lots of folks in the audience today who work within schools, and so that was really beneficial to see that school belonging seems to be protective. We're wondering, can you tell us some examples of things specifically that schools and communities can do to help promote that feeling of belongingness?
I think that's a great question. And so again, the idea of belonging is defined often by the folks that we're working with, right? So that I want to say that. And a lot of the common sort of factors that we have gotten from a lot of the young people that we're working with are anything from the presence of like a GSA, so a formal group, right? Or a support group in some ways, because those are sometimes a little bit different. Things that are, maybe quite public, like a celebrating of, National Coming Out Day, Transgender Awareness Day, or some sort of notation of that, right? Also, policies certainly, I think, can be quite helpful within the context. And then young people knowing about the policies, right? Having restrooms that are, optional, that restrooms that might include, restrooms that are not binary or gender-based specifically, although I know that's hard in a school, but there have been some that have found that to be helpful. So very outward, but also the more implicit pieces of having maybe an out gay teacher or coach, right? Or principal, and somebody who talks about it. And also teachers who will maybe mention LGBT folks in the classroom, right? Or talk about not erasure, right? Not invisibilizing. That's also something that they found, that young people have found to be have found to be really helpful. And the actual interrupting. So knowing that if a teacher is around or a counselor is around, as much as possible, if there is some bullying that's happening, they will in fact interrupt and not say you're both in trouble, but say, no, you can't use that word to describe this other person, right? So being, not just interrupting, but also saying maybe something sort of proactively positive about the LGBT young person. So feeling like that also for some, and I know this is being able to dress in the gender that they feel more comfortable, not having strict, gender rules, those kinds. So it's just this kind of broad representation in some ways, which can be very overt policies, but can also be more implicit behaviors because they know, right? They notice, they pay attention. So all of those things help them feel like they belong within the context of a school setting. And the other thing is that, so sometimes we feel a bit nervous, I think sometimes, about reaching out to a young person that we think might be LGBT, but they may not have come out to us. We do find in a lot of our research, and we get that because we don't want to out somebody, but just a general kind of casual, we have this new group that's starting for LGBT folks. If you're interested, or, you have some friends, that helps them feel seen and validated. And often they show up, right? So we're kind of extending that versus just putting in a flyer and having them come, but that gentle kind of welcoming them in is also something that helps them feel like they belong. But I think that's a great question. And we've learned a lot from the young people that we worked with around what that can mean. And I also think just asking them sometimes is also helpful.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Dr. Craig. We so appreciate your time and expertise and wisdom. And so many folks have expressed their gratitude for all of the really helpful information that you shared this morning. We thank you all for your questions as well. We are now going to take a break until 10:15, at which time we will resume for the second keynote.